Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. I think we'll start, since we have two lectures, as we have the last few weeks, and we have a lot to get through. I'm Ann Rieselbach, the Program Director of the Architectural League, and I'd like to welcome you to the final night of lectures by this year's Emerging Voices. Tonight, we will be hearing from the New Orleans firm, Colloqate Design Studio, and Mobley, based here in New York City, two of the 8 North American practices selected through an invited annual juried competition that recognizes talented individuals and firms with a distinct design voice that have the potential to influence the discipline of architecture, landscape architecture, and urbanism. Further information about all of this year's winners can be found in the extensive coverage provided by the Architects newspaper. There are copies on the table. If you didn't grab one coming in, grab one coming out or going out. You can also read more about each firm and all of the recent winners over the past 4 or 5 years, I think it is, on the League's website, including interviews and additional editorial content. In addition, you can find a list of all the past winners, which dates back to 1982. This is a really long-running program. For an in-depth survey of the program, the League publication Idea Form Resonance covers its first 30 seasons, including work by all of the winners, as well as accompanying essays that contextualize the work. Before I introduce tonight's speakers, some thanks are in order. The Emerging Voices series is made possible through the generosity of the program's sponsors. On behalf of the League, I'd like to thank principal supporters Elise Jaffe and Jeffrey Brown for their continued enthusiasm and support. Additional support for the series is provided by public funds from the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs in partnership with the City Council, and by the Next Generation Fund of the Architectural League, which is an annual fund supported by past Emerging Voices and also winners of the League Prize for Young Architects and Designers. League programs are also supported in part by public funds from the New York State Council on the Arts with the support of Governor Andrew Cuomo and the New York State Legislature. And thanks, since this is the final night of the series, to the League staff who make this possible, Program Manager Katerina Flaxman, who along with Sarah Wessler, Ann Carlisle, and Katie Rotman have insightfully and efficiently coordinated and publicized this year's programs. This year's Emerging Voices have once again demonstrated the breadth and diversity of contemporary practice. Their work exemplifies how architects can effectively test questions about where and how we build, including new configurations for multi-unit dwellings, optimizing marginal sites, and situating accessory dwelling units. We've seen the potential of material experimentation, as well as time-tested building techniques and hands-on construction that allows for an element of chance. Both firms speaking tonight extend the capacity of architectural thinking and design strategies beyond traditional practice to address, in a sense, the figurative and literal infrastructure of place. They are both interdisciplinary, merging art, architecture, analysis, and activism. In some project, each firm's ideas find form in an architecture of insertions, revisioning and activating incomplete or liminal structures. There is a dynamism to their work, a reconsideration of meaning, active engagement with the public, and an expression of movement, as you will see in how they choose to illustrate their research, design propositions, and realized work through demonstrating its responsive design and form. You have brief biographies of tonight's speakers, including their education, significant awards, and some basic firm information. So instead, my brief introductions will focus on some of the jury's observations about their work, as well as their ideas as explored in some of the League's online editorial features, beginning with our first speakers, Sue Mobley and Bryan Lee Jr. of the New Orleans firm Colloqate Design Studio. In a discussion with the League's digital editor, Sarah Wessler, Bryan identified the recently founded firm's primary focus, work centered around doing social practice. The two principals wear a number of hats. Bryan is an architect who also leads Project Pipeline, a year-long mentorship program for high school students to introduce the principles of architecture. Sue is a policy expert who has carried out a number of public education initiatives. She worked at the Small Center for Collaborative Design at Tulane School of Architecture and taught the fundamentals of social design in Tulane studios. Together, Bryan and Sue understand architecture as an ecosystem of interrelated nodes of power, including pedagogy, policy, practice, and people. The legacy and current implications of these relationships say how education shapes policy and policy shapes structure are responsible for institutional inequities. As the two describe, for every injustice in the world, there is an architecture to facilitate it. Their practice is devoted to reforming this ecosystem within academia and the community to foster the potential for change. The jury found Colloqate's text and projects exemplified an important activist voice dealing with the American city, race, and equity, one with an interesting design language that itself was emerging as they developed new strategies to identify, analyze, and grapple with historic inequities implicit in city planning and the built environment. Their efforts are realized at a range of scales, architectural and social, from envisioning the potential for a new large-scale cultural district between a New Orleans expressway to their Paper Monuments campaign and convening a design justice summit. Yet, within their serious social mission and growing impact, jurors also appreciated an iconoclastic spirit and a little bit of constructive irreverence in Colloqate's work, which we are all looking forward to seeing and hearing about tonight.
Good evening. How are we feeling today? That's what I like. It wasn't as good as I wanted.
No.
Start again.
Come on.
How are we feeling today? There we go.
There we go.
It's slightly better. You'll work on it for the next group. All right. Thank you. Again, we just want to say thank you to the League, to our friends and family and supporters who have been with us this entire time. This is a labor of love, obviously, but it is a way in which we get to express not just the advocacy and activism that we try to do in our daily lives, but put it into the work that we do on a day-to-day basis. So again, my name is Bryan Seeley Jr.
I'm Suzanne Mobley.
And we are Colloqate. Yeah. So, no need. So a lot of people ask just off the top, what does Colloqate mean? And really the combination of words is colloquial and location, right? Like, so colloquial, locate. But the definition for locate is quite beautiful. And it talks about the sequence of words and phrases habitually juxtaposed at a higher frequency or a greater frequency than chance. And so when we talk about what we do as a practice, we are talking about the sequence of people and places habitually juxtaposed with one another at a frequency greater than chance.
And so we are a design practice, but we are a nonprofit design practice and a nonprofit design justice practice.
Definitely. And so to try to give you a little sense of what that means, we find ourselves falling somewhere between the community design centers and for-profit practice. We're not going to go too deep into this, but this is a graph so that you can take a picture and we can move on. Get it? All right.
We both talk a lot, so we're trying to contain ourselves.
Yeah, because you'll be here for like 3 hours if we do that. So anyway, the idea is really that the profession within the scope of services that we generally have does not allow us to actually dig deep into the social practice, and the necessary social practice of the work allows us to actually get resolutions that are not usually met through work that serves marginalized communities. And so again, I'll just flip through these, but ultimately we're looking at what for-profit practices do, what community design practices do, what social practice art can do. And obviously these are not specific, but you can see that they grow and change. And what nonprofit practices have the ability to do.
And so we're a nonprofit because taking advantage of the philanthropic model allows us to spend the time in communities to build the type of reciprocal relationships that you only get over time, that you only get by being present, and that you can't build if it's a race to the finish to meet a deadline on a project. We think that those relationships are incredibly important, and that in order to do real design justice, you have to give them the space to grow.
Yeah. So here are a couple just major points for what we think about, and again, we'll give you some grounding so that you can understand where the work actually comes from. So design justice at its core is about seeking to challenge the privilege and power structures that use architecture and design as a means to perpetuate injustice in the world, specifically in the built environment. And so what you heard earlier, for every injustice, there is an architecture that facilitates and perpetuates it, is something that we live by because we want to make sure that we recognize the ways in which that shows itself in the world.
And we want to amplify the expertise of residents, people who know their places, their communities, their needs and desires better than we ever could.
We want to build collective power in communities. Oftentimes, we're not doing things for people. We want to make sure that communities who already have power know how to challenge or channel that power in the right ways.
And we want to lift up the histories of place and people that create the potential for new paradigms to emerge, for imagining new futures together.
Cool. So out of that work, we often start with these 5 core questions for that work, right? So those core questions, what are the power structures that hold power in that community? So who holds power in that space? What are the injustices that result from that power? Who is directly and disproportionately impacted? How does it manifest in the physical environment? So there's always someone who is getting the brunt of that work in the physical environment. How does the absence or activation of space impact those communities? And then the last thing really is, what are the opportunities? Not just the opportunities to challenge the systems, but the opportunities to create new worlds, to create new stories in those environments.
So what does that mean in practice? It means that we are a small 5-person firm that tries to create civic, communal, and cultural spaces that both require and allow us to organize and advocate along with design.
Yeah, we're speaking through the lens of racial, social, and cultural justice, and we like to convene across different communities, obviously.
And to strive for welcome within those communities and sustained engagement with our practice, with each other, and across difference, rather than merely creating points of access and exchange.
Yeah. So to start with, I want to show you one of my favorite set of images because it kind of gets to the point of why we do this work, why it's so important that this work actually has an outlet that is physical and not just in policy, not just in academia, right? There's 2 images here. Gordon Parks, this image over here on your right. And I juxtapose these images for a reason. Oftentimes when we think about prejudice, when we think about bias, when we think about racism in this country, we look at the image on your left. We often think that it's about the individual harassment that actually impacts an individual. And it does. It's absolutely impactful. But the image on the right here, you see that both of these spaces are telling you that you don't belong, right? You don't belong in this place. And so what does it mean when someone takes a sign, and you see this neon sign up here? They take that sign, they put the gas in it, they turn it, they make sure that the sign goes up, and they're happy about it. And they're just like, look, son, I did a sign. And it says, colored entrance. And you're complicit in that whole process. You're entirely complicit. And so really the idea that our work cannot be detached from the social context to which it's in. We can't just say that we can do small things devoid of reaction in that place. You have people who are trying to maintain their dignity in spite of all the things. You don't see any other human beings yelling or spitting at these people. You see a sign that tells them that they are less than. You see a building that maintains that structure. You see policies that allow that building and that sign to exist. Yes? So we're going to talk to you a little bit about how this whole thing started. A lot of this work, all of this work, is grounded in other folks doing the hard work of activism and advocacy over generations to make it possible for us. And I tend to ground that first and foremost in the architectural sense at Tuskegee Institute, which was sort of a mecca when it comes to thinking about African Americans in design, especially in the early the early 20th century. So Booker T. Washington and Robert Taylor, Booker T. Washington had this obvious bent towards education. And what you saw in the late 1800s was a man who actually decided to expand just this 100-acre lot of land to 2,000 acres and to create a program that taught young African-American people to design space. Right? To design as architects, continued space. Robert Taylor from MIT came down and helped to create that program in a really exhaustive manner. They built over 50 buildings in that space, design and build. The premise of that allowed for many architects to leave that particular space, and later in life, from 1917 to 1932, after Booker T. Washington passed away, the Rosenwald schools came up. Now, this is at a time when you saw massive amounts of public space and civic infrastructure being occupied by a couple major things. One was the 1,700 different monuments, racist monuments that went up across the country. You also saw a massive amount of lynching trees and lynchings, obviously. But in response, not even in response, direct response, but you saw 5,300 schools designed and built in that time to support education during segregation. You also saw activists and advocates partnering up to pursue long-term goals, goals that they may not even see during their lifetime. This is the African American Museum, 1916. You see the letter that talks about the failure to erect a special memorial may and probably will be interpreted as meaning Negroes have made no great contribution to American advancement, right? Over 100 years, efforts of activists and advocates have moved these things forward to where we have one of the most iconic buildings to be built in the last century.
And so to back us up, when Tuskegee is getting started training activist architects, it's part of a larger progressive movement. It's part of an era that's engaging with social science for the first time and thinking about how we shape our cities. And a lot of the work that happens in that period is about narrative change. It's about the introduction of the idea of how the other half lives. The idea that we would tell stories of the poor, that those would be centered, and that the wealthy had a responsibility to partake in advocacy and in efforts to make lives better. And to some extent, that's about erasing lines in the built environment, and to some extent, that's about opening doors for a greater democratic responsibility. When Du Bois writes The Philadelphia Negro, which is still a tremendous work, it's tying race to labor and housing. It's talking about the ways in which there's an intersection interclass within the Black community. It's talking about ways in which we consider how the Black community is distributed across Philadelphia. And it's a radical change in how America has been talking and thinking about race. So the progressive era is an era of elite-led reforms, of settlement houses and women's clubs, but it's also an era of an emerging militant labor struggle. In 1905, the IWW forms, creating the possibility of militant interracial labor movement for the first time since Virginia passed its slave code. The intersection of what's happening at Tuskegee and what's happening nationally in terms of this emerging movement of progressive reform are inextricably linked. They're locked together, and that progresses to the present.
So we'll move to the civil rights era, where we start to see the influence of the larger civil rights movement floating into architecture. And we oftentimes single out Max Bohm, but Arc and other architects across the spectrum, we're actually coming out of this era as well. But really, what you get out of Max Bond, and one of the kind of iconic kind of considerations was that the Stokely Carmichaels of the world had influenced Julian Bond, his cousin, had influence in the direction to which he thought architecture should go, and he expressed that on a consistent basis. Whitney M. Young, I'm not going to go into this too deep because most of you have heard this, but Whitney M. Young really, out of his 1968 speech to the American Institute of Architects, speaks about the fact that we have been thunderously silent in our efforts towards civic and social responsibility. Right? And he talks about the fact that we see these spaces, we acknowledge that they exist, and yet we do nothing. And so what does it mean for us as architects to take that challenge and to push things forward? The AIA helped fund some of the early community design centers after that, but a lot of the funds for that waned pretty quickly.
And so when we talk about the civil rights era, so much of what is happening is about public space in contention. It's about the claims to public accommodation. It's about who has the right to be where, in parks, in restaurants, on transportation, and schools. But it's also about the emergence of women's voices as leaders in a movement, women's voices that are still contested space of their own. And the emergence of women within the civil rights movement helps to power that movement, but also helps to feed what will become a greater opening of public democracy and of broader movements. And so we begin to see the feminist movement, we begin to see the Native American movements, we begin to see movements for LGBTQIA rights emerge at the end of the civil rights era. And those movements all have weak spots. And one of them is that the way in which they're pursued helps to break down some of the cohesion that was possible within the IWW, helps to claim space in ways that separate rather than bring people together. There are a lot of strength in those movements, too.
So, before we wrap this part of it up, but there were a lot of reactive and reactionary conditions, obviously, in this timeline, right, when we're talking about the Civil Rights era. And we saw the Black Panther Party for Survival and Beyond activate a lot of considerations around public and civic space. The entire intention was to teach young people, to make sure that education was a core part of the life of a young black person, to feed them, to make sure that food was accessible at all times. And this will come back. We're saying this, I promise you, for a reason, because these things show back up in our work. And this is why it's important to have the grounding in it. We also saw the National Organization of Minority Architects pop up. And in New Orleans, we saw the Claiborne Avenue Design Team, which is a precursor to some of the work that we've been able to do. And really what they did, again, the model of activists, architects, lawyers, designers in space challenging the impacts of larger infrastructural moments made a really significant point. And so the moral of that really is the fact that form doesn't just follow function, it follows fiction. It follows the narratives, the stories that are told. It follows the mythology that we hold to be true about ourselves. So thusly, we'll talk about the Claiborne Innovation District.
So the context of Claiborne, and I promise I will be shorter on history this time, is that Claiborne Avenue had been the black business district of New Orleans. It was a civic space. It was lined with oak trees, the longest stand of oak trees in the country. It was the center of black carnival, in contrast to white Mardi Gras. And in 1968, it was leveled. Over 300 businesses, over 200 trees, because power flows to power. And it was possible to run a highway down Claiborne in a way that it was not possible to run a highway through the French Quarter. Claiborne remains part of New Orleans' urban fabric as a civic space because people are resilient and cultures are resilient. And so Under the Bridge is where you go to watch brass bands, to follow a second line, to see Mardi Gras Indians on St. Joseph's Night. And it's a critical piece of how the city defines itself. So when the question was raised after Hurricane Katrina of whether the highway would be brought down, and questions were asked of the neighborhood, there was a lot of contention around what was to be done with that space. There were many neighbors who were frightened that if the overpass came down, the gentrification that was moving from the French Quarter would be hastened, that the only thing protecting their homes was that big, ugly highway. That sentiment was encouraged by advocates who stepped in to say, don't respond to the survey, don't show up to the meetings, and we ended up leaving up the highway because there wasn't enough interest to bring it down. I don't know whether the choice to leave it up or bring it down would have been better, but I know the fact that it's there provided an opportunity for us to think about how to better use it.
And so that's what we did. Again, as Sue mentioned, we used the space. But if you think about the way in which a highway tears through a neighborhood, again, 396 businesses existed, 350 of them wiped away, have not really recovered since then. The neighborhood still had to heal itself. And as Sue mentioned, the culture helped that happen. And so when we talk about what it means to not just engage, and we make a distinction between organizing and engagement, in that engagement is very much still a research exercise. It very much is a way for us to collect data and then spit out an output. Organizing and outreach requires us to build agency to make sure that those who are in this space are leaving with more than what they came in with. And so in that pursuit, instead of asking people to come to our meetings, we went to theirs. And this is the Treme 7th Ward Festival. And this was kind of the start of this program for us, in which we worked with community members to actually build a booth to talk explicitly about what the project wants to be and what people thought it should be moving forward. And so we took that time, we went through the design process with young people and the community members around us, and started to think through what design might look like in the context of this little mini festival, this little mini city exhibition. And so that allowed for people to tell us the stories about what was past and present and future, what they wanted to see there, who they wanted to memorialize in this space, and how they wanted to hold and claim space. We always talk about the fact that revolutions happen through the claiming of space. And the only way to do that is to make sure you understand the history and the ways in which future wants to be defined. So in that, we held really 20 different kind of workshops for people. So this was really, how do we build people's acumen around this? How do we make sure that people had a direct impact on the process? And so we started to think about the ways in which design intervened along that space that tried to stitch these two edges of a broken neighborhood back together. We looked at the fact that this 100-foot span obviously did not allow light through it, but we wanted to make sure that people still had a rhythmic flow through that space. We wanted to make sure that the things that already utilize this space, the second lines, the bikes that are there, still had access to this. And so all of the designs were really flexible. They still tried to maintain the open air space as much as possible underneath there. So we worked with green infrastructure. We made sure that we had the largest challenge was always environmental, and so we always had the conversation of green infrastructure at top. We made sure that the advocates who actually did this work on the ground were in the room, were leading conversations, and were able to actually input directly on on the design. We worked with elders who had the history, who locked the history, who would keep us in the room for 5 hours past, telling stories.
If you let them, days, y'all.
Yeah. Come down, we'll put y'all in a room with them for a little bit. We worked with artists. Our artists are the key to the city. 14% of our city's labor force is artists. We work with business owners, obviously those on both sides of the street, and especially when you're dealing with a community that has been shattered in so many different ways, specifically around businesses. The fear was that if you allow more businesses to come in this space, I will lose out, as opposed to the notion that more businesses in this space allow us to build stronger. And one of the things that we learned, not only out of the business workshop, but out of some of the other kind of departments within our city, is that, again, 90 to 95% of Black and brown businesses are 1 to 3 people throughout the entirety of their existence. And what that means is that you change the output when folks are not aligned with the necessary statistics for small businesses, whether that's federal, state, or local. And it changes what the design looks like. We had youth workshops that were a vital part of this. And we reported out. I don't have that sheet. So we captured every single comment from every single individual. We made sure that those things were not just kept in a report, but fed back, and made sure that those things people had an opportunity to challenge that. And so what we came up with was a design that was flexible, that did not allow people to be run out of their business by rising taxes year over year. It allowed for the space to stay flexible over time, and to have booths that fit the cultural necessity in the space. And so in that piece, you saw, again, the range of accessibility. And you're talking about a space that has 144 square feet that can expand even further. We, again, wanted to make sure that we consumed this towering thing. What does it look like to actually start to build a canopy underneath this space, build levels so that people have the opportunity to... There are very few moments in New Orleans where we actually get height. And so the opportunity to raise one's level and to still be surrounded with the context is very rare. We wanted to make sure that we started to mask and screen some of those spaces and make sure that the energy of the space could be felt throughout the corridor. This is 19 blocks, 250,000 square feet. And this is what we start to see out of that. These are actually designed by some of the artists, actually, and the intention was that New Orleans has one of the highest murder rates in the country, and what you heard a lot was, we want something spiritual, maybe not religious. One of the poets that works with us always talks about the fact that it doesn't matter what religion you are in New Orleans, you're Catholic. So you can be Catholic Jewish, you can be Catholic Baptist, you can be whatever. But it is something that's necessary to keep the altar, the spirit, bound to this place. And these are spaces to pay homage and to honor those who have left us.
So our next project, Blights Out, centers around housing, but also around language. 10 years out from Hurricane Katrina, New Orleans was barely recovered from losing 80% of its housing stock. Ironically, we had back 84% of our population, but not the same population, just the numbers. So much of the network of housing and housing projects was unilaterally destroyed, leaving low-income families to concentrate with Section 8 vouchers in 7 districts, 7 census tracts in New Orleans East, far from public transportation, far from jobs, far from any of the sort of basic necessities of life. And we lost what were the downtown housing projects that had been, at various points, dangerous, derelict, left to be blighted, which were also home and a safe place in storms, and incredibly sturdy bastions of community. Those were policy choices that were made, and they were policy choices that cast people out. these are some of the policy choices that keep them locked out. These are all the considerations that one has to take to bring a blighted or abandoned house back in New Orleans. And some of the most challenging can be around succession, because we have Napoleonic code layered over with 130 years of bureaucratic finagling. If my grandfather built a house and then passed away, all of his children would have a right to inherit, and so would all of his grandchildren. And so if I was living in that house when it flooded and wanted to be able to reclaim it and receive funds to rebuild it, I would have to prove title. And if that had been formally passed to me, that'd be one thing. But if it hadn't, it would mean that I would have to go find all of those surviving heirs, all 16 grandchildren and 4 children, and get them to sign off on it. So needless to say, it takes a lot for property to change hands in New Orleans, except when it goes to auction. So properties that are cited as blighted and have code complaints can be auctioned off by the sheriff. Properties that were handed over to Road Home after the storm could be auctioned off by the redevelopment authority. Those get turned over to land speculators, but very rarely to the working class families that make up our city. That's what Blights Out set out to challenge.
Yeah, this was an extreme project that was thinking about the ways in which individual and ephemeral, it was quite extreme. We actually, we were deep in it.
It was a little extreme.
And we kind of love it. But the project started with that basic contention. And we did a couple things during that process. We tried to buy a property to bear out the development process, to make sure that we understood exactly what it looked like, and the end result would be a piece of architecture that showed all of the processes unraveled. What we ran into is this list of things which we didn't know about beforehand. And so what it turned into was a way for us to actually do something at a smaller scale and challenge that system, be omnipresent in a way that we couldn't by just having a singular space. And so what it became was a campaign to talk explicitly about those issues. The first campaign was Blights Out for President. And you see these yard signs here. We placed these yard signs in the context of the other campaigning signs across the city, stark black, to draw obvious attention to the matter at hand, which was a fantastic way for us to actually have conversations that we're not having on a daily basis. The second part of this project was Blights Out for Mayor during a mayoral election. And this was right up the street from the property we tried to purchase. And it was really about the ways in which we actually took definitions and processes and made them explicit to community, right? It's not just about us putting something up pretty that is the result of a process. It is about us exemplifying or showing, shining a light on that process. And so we took each definition, we talked through it with people. We had meetings and convenings. We held poetry slams underneath it. We did all of the things to kind of draw attention to the larger issues of blight in our city. We even started to pull out Louisiana constitutional code to show people exactly where to look and poke at it. All right.
You do.
So, the last of our 3 projects that we want to talk about is obviously near and dear to our heart. It's the one that we're constantly on right now. Now, if you talk to us, it'll be the only thing we talk about.
That's why it's last.
The idea of civic and democratic space has obviously ran throughout this presentation, but it to bear in our city about 3 years ago, with the efforts of the most recent set of activists, Take 'Em Down NOLA, which really pursued efforts to remove white supremacist monuments across the city. There are over 100, whether that's street signs, schools, or monuments themselves, and they put in a massive amount of time and effort to make that possible. And so one of the first interactions and interventions we started with was one to talk explicitly about bringing the full context of one of these people to light. Now, this is Robert E. Lee on the top of this podium. And Robert E. Lee enslaved 195 human beings, was brutal. And some people will say, on his deathbed, he tried to change his mind. I don't care. Doesn't matter at all. So one of the tasks we set out to do was to reveal all of that additional information. So what does it look like for us to actually project onto this column the histories and stories of the individual that we have been lionizing for so many years in this city? That kicked off a process that 3 years later led us to taking it down.
And so throughout the process of monument removal, there were 3 statues that were taken down at night. And at each of them, it was contentious and it was fraught. And there were people with flags that I swear they must have gone home and sewn a new flag every night, and torches and angry. And then there were the rest of us on the other side, sharing drinks and hanging out and celebrating. And at one point, I walked up at Beauregard, and it was very clear which side was which from a couple blocks away. And the sides were separated by barricades, which in New Orleans is a terribly effective way to separate people because we're all really well trained by Mardi Gras. So a barricade that you could shove over is somehow like an immovable object. And it looked a lot like walking up to a wedding and looking down the aisle and seeing the bride's side and the groom's side, except that it was very clearly the wrong side of history and the right side of history. And I offered to make some giant cards for the back and to buy some tiny violins.
The tiny violin thing was amazing because we walked up that evening. I'm just going to be really quick about this because it's hilarious to me. Whatever, it doesn't have to be hilarious to you. But ultimately, I walked up this evening after a flight, and I'm like, Sue, this is crazy. We should get them. I mean, again, they have all these flags. We should get them little tiny violins so that we can just play them at them, right? And Sue was like, that's a great idea. Organized in 5 minutes. She had raised $1,000 and got 50 people to join in it. So it was quite amazing to kind of tie again these ideas at different scale.
Turns out that it takes longer for Amazon to ship tiny violins than it took to get the next statue down. So out of that removal, out of that conversation of 8 hours of pulling down a man on a horse and wrapping him carefully in bubble wrap, we started a conversation that we've been having for 2 years about what's next. How do we imagine new monuments for New Orleans? And so the values of paper monuments are about inclusion and about equity and about a radically democratic process. We are asking everyone, literally everyone, what they want to see in our public spaces. What are the people, places, events, and movements that matter? And to do that, we had to do a little front-end work to restore complexity and to leverage systems so that we could think about how New Orleans public space works differently, but also to think about how New Orleans narrative can work differently. So for 100 years, New Orleans has been selling itself to the world. Tourism's our primary driver of our economy. And we've been selling ourselves to the world, telling the kinds of stories that you tell when you want people to keep coming back and spending money. So they're romanticized, and they're simplified, and they're lovely, and they're very, very simple. And they're so ubiquitous that even scholars of the city incorporate them into their narratives, into their literal scholarly work, because it's so embedded that those stories aren't questioned. So in order to ask people what's missing, we needed to start telling stories that we knew were missing. And so we created a poster series, which in retrospect is a little weird.
Well, it's not weird because we ain't had no money, so I think that
Okay,
was
that's fair.
That was the
That's totally fair.
the impetus to start.
But what we did have was a great network of people at a conference called Design Futures who were sharing an article amongst themselves and with us that nobody had opened that talked about a group in Philadelphia called Monument Lab, who were asking the residents of that city what was an appropriate monument for Philly today. And then we had another great asset and a friend who sat on their board, who walked up to the table and said, hey, you should be talking to these guys. So we did. And for 6 months, we talked to them once a week. We talked about the differences in what it meant to do the work that they were doing in Philadelphia in that physical context of a dense city with a lot of use of public space, with money and resources that had been put into art and parks and civic spaces. And then what it meant to take on this work in a city that had just seen Confederate monuments removed, in a city where white supremacists had threatened to invade en masse and had been stationed on corners with guns for months.
And mind you, they burnt the contractor's car. I mean, there wasn't just threats of violence, there was actual violence.
So we're combating a narrative of New Orleans, and we're working in a context of latent violence. So let's reach out to a bunch of academics. I reached out to 85 scholars of the city and asked them, what stories do you want to tell? What's missing from the narrative that you would want to see represented in our public spaces? And Bryan reached out to 45 artists to ask if they would be willing to illustrate. And then we set out on this intervention, series of interventions that is still iterative and still shaping our public spaces in the city. We took advantage of the systems that were already in place, leveraging the transit system in New Orleans to locate our poster installations, our large-scale galleries. And the reason for that is that that little cluster of yellow dots where we did a bunch of interventions, that's Canal Street. That's the line that in 1805 divided the French part of the city from the American. Because that line is somehow indelibly etched onto New Orleans, our buses don't cross it. 10 years after the storm, we had 85% of our population back, 34% of public transit, and Canal Street was still where you stopped to wait to change. Those waits were so long that Tulane School of Public Health has set up health fairs where you can have full screenings while you wait for your next bus. That's terrible for our city. It's an opportunity for us because we didn't want to create posters that went home with a handful of people. We didn't want to create histories that went into a book that nobody touched. We wanted people to read them and see themselves in them. So we created a series of galleries that were city block long at those transit stations. Opportunities for people to read the stories and opportunities for us to collect people's public proposals for what they wanted to see. But also opportunities for us to have every tour, every talk, every media coverage also focused on the brokenness of our transit system and how poorly it serves working class New Orleanians. Our civic infrastructure of libraries and rec centers is stretched across the city, and our interventions there stretched across the city as well. Sorry. We've done a lot of work with the public libraries and a lot of work using the rec centers as distribution and intake points. We've held events at libraries to help people research stories that they felt they wanted to tell but didn't feel comfortable telling because they didn't feel like they knew enough. Our History Unbound event at the main library was probably our largest age range one, with our youngest participant being 4 and our oldest being 84. We saw over 500 people come through in the course of the day with support of librarians from all of the branches across the city. As Bryan said, about 14% of our population is artists of one variety of another, and New Orleans is known for its culture and does an exceedingly poor job protecting its cultural institutions and its cultural workers. One of the most important parts of this project for us as we designed it was the ability to run it as an ethical project, to ensure that every artist who created a poster was paid, that everyone who created a sculpture was paid, that everyone who was a writer who wasn't part of an academic institution was paid for their labor and their expertise. But also to make sure that we used our cultural institutions as what they are, gathering sites and opportunities to share new stories. So we've been at galleries and music venues. We've paraded along with second lines. We've set up tables all over the city. We've also set up events to have artists live create monuments, proposals over the course of an hour and a half based on narratives that were told. Our school system is devastated after the storm. Our school system was privatized. Our teachers' union was busted. 7,400 people were thrown out of work, and we are the only all-charter system in the country. We are Betsy DeVos's dream. In order for us to reach students across New Orleans charter schools, it means negotiating with each school to get access. It means negotiating the space in which teachers may or may not feel empowered enough to talk about histories of their students' city and families with them, where teachers may not feel that they know enough because they're not from here and not rooted in our culture. We've been working closely with schools in part because we think it's important to reach youth as part of this project. We've also been working with university-level institutions to help preserve it, so that the Amistad Research Center at Tulane will have the archive of all of our posters, and the Midlow Center for New Orleans Studies at the University of New Orleans will have every single public proposal. They'll also be available online for future researchers. And finally, the system that we, of course, leverage most is that of public space. We are a public project. We're public art, we're public history. We occupy public space as a matter of course. And in the past several weeks, we've been occupying public space in new ways. The pictures on either side are temporary installations, our phase 2. The opportunity for 10 artists who were jury selected to draw from the public proposals, to draw from what everyday citizens said they wanted to see in our public spaces, and to create their own interpretations of them, still made out of paper, but 3-dimensional, and up for 6 weeks in our highly unforgiving climate. Really hoping they make it. So I feel like I've referenced public proposals a couple times and not really gone into them. I know. And I'm going to blow through this very quickly because we're on time, but this really is the core of the project. So you should come to our website or come talk to me to find out more. Our goal is to reach everyone. Our goal was to hit a minimum of 1,500 public proposals and to create a representative sample to make sure that our public proposal pool looked like New Orleans. Our demographic distribution is across the city. Our demographic details are in high fidelity to the population of the city. We're tracking for native and non-native, short and long term, in a way that there isn't a data set for, but has become one of the more salient distinctions that people make about themselves over the past 10 years. And all of that data is important because that's how we prove that we're reaching everyone, and that's how we make the argument to the city, and it's how we make the argument to the people who didn't want the statues to come down that this is what should go up. But what's really important isn't the demographics, it's the stories. It's what people say that they want to see. People who are answering our question, who are responding to the prompt to imagine new monuments for New Orleans, are talking about New Orleans culture. They're talking about canonical figures from jazz and early R&B. They're talking more about the street level culture, about the second lines and Mardi Gras Indians, about the bounce music and rap that make up the fabric of lived culture in our city today. They're talking about love. They're talking about love for each other, familial love, maternal love, love of place. Because we oversampled children, when we started this project, I thought that we were going to see a ton of proposals from mothers, from kids who were like 5 and 6. And it turns out that that's not when we see them. There are 2 age bumps in proposals from mothers. It's 9 to 11, when kids start to be more independent and are leaving mom behind. And then there's another one in the 40s and 50s, when mothers start to die. Loss is the central theme of our public proposals. When people are talking about Blackness and envisioning Blackness in our city, they're both talking about histories and historiographies that have been lost, but also about the loss of Black citizens in our city now. When people are talking about historical correctives and the feminine, they're talking about what has been erased and what they fear will be erased. Some of the most interesting proposals fall in the category of the historical corrective. It's not surprising that the feminine is such a central focus, and it's not surprising that the number of people who answered the optional identity question with gender is high. Women are wildly underrepresented in public memorials. And anything that speaks of a historical corrective, of course, is going to center the fact that half the population isn't present.
So as you've seen, this is scaled up, and the whole intention that when a damaging piece happens to a neighborhood, when you see something like a highway or you see something like monuments to supremacy evading your space, you can't just react and put something directly back up. You have to actually give people some time and space. And so you've seen us go from proposals and posters, and that's scaling up, coming off the wall into public space, and that will scale up even further as we move through this process. And one of the ways in which we're trying to envision that is to reinterpret some of these proposals at a scale that shows them in the context of the city. And so what you've seen here is the Imagine Monuments portion of this project, which starts to take these proposals and draw them out a little bit, collage them so that people can actually get a sense of context and how it might look within that space. So here's one that is in downtown New Orleans in the CBD that really starts to speak about the fact that our waterways and our water systems rule our space, and we have to either live with that or perish. Obviously an ode to the music of the city, and allows you to play any song from New Orleans history at any given time. And this one I found particularly touching, a conversation around the hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of enslaved people who were brought to the shores in New Orleans. So what does it mean for us to actually represent and acknowledge that? Right now there is one plaque in the entire city. There were, again, hundreds of thousands to millions of black and brown bodies who were brought to bear here, and Irish. What does it mean for us to actually represent them? Not as enslaved people, but as the people they were before they were stolen from those places. So lastly, we want to leave you with this thought, this notion that language, the language we use is extremely important. Architecture is a language, and architecture, like all languages, allows us to tell a story.
And stories are important. Buildings tell our stories, and diverse stories come from diverse culture.
And culture is obviously important. And the culture is the consequence of persistent circumstance and immediate condition. And our cities, our neighborhoods, our blocks incubate this culture. So for people of color in America, there is power in the places and spaces where our culture is recognized, where our stories are told, and where our language is valued.
Because that's not only good design, that's justice.
Thank you.
Thank you.